the propaganda against China is so cartoonishly absurd. We're talking about levels, it's almost approaching the fake news on North Korea. Here is an article that was just published in The Telegraph, a major British newspaper, which is often known as the Tory graph because it's very close to the British Conservative Party, that is the Tories. And this insane article is titled, "China is building, quote, brain control weaponry to use against Uyghurs, says United States." Of course, they tag on there at the end, says the United States. America places new sanctions on Beijing as human rights groups say China is using artificial intelligence and DNA tracking to keep tabs on the Muslim minority. Now, this article is ridiculous propaganda in the Tory graph. Brain control weaponry. But then you actually read the article, which, by the way, a lot of people probably don't do because it's behind a paywall. So here is a screen capture because, again, you have to pay to read this dumb article. Or you can go to archive.today. I'll get up the archive.today version so you can get behind the paywall. By Nick Allen, December 17th. Joe Biden's administration announced the sanctions over surveillance in Xinjiang, where human rights groups, unnamed, they say the Chinese government has been honing new technologies. The U.S. Commerce Department said it was sanctioning China's Academy of Military Medical Sciences and 11 of its research institutes over biotechnology work, including, quote, purported brain control weaponry. And then the Tory graph adds, it did not give details on what the weaponry was. So this is ridiculous propaganda. It's also, from the perspective of the Telegraph, this is just dumb clickbait. They admit that the U.S. government did not actually explain what this so-called brain control weaponry is. This is propaganda. Brain control weaponry. You got to be kidding me. It didn't actually name what that is. It's just propaganda. And then they quote the U.S. Commerce Secretary saying, unfortunately, the People's Republic of China is choosing to use these technologies to pursue control over its people. Yeah, talk about projection. Who helped create and invent and pioneer mass surveillance? Have you ever heard of the NSA? Ring a bell? But no, I mean, this is ridiculous propaganda, but it's yet another example of how U.S. editorial standards on China they're at the point where you can make up anything you want. And if the U.S. government says it, you don't need any evidence. You don't need any details. All you can do is just report it as a fact by regurgitating what the U.S. government says. And that gives it authority. As if the U.S. government has never lied about the Gulf of Tonkin incident, about babies in incubators in Kuwait, about WMDs, about Russiagate, about Cablegate, supposedly, or rather, not Cablegate, what was it called? Bountygate, rather, of Russia supposedly paying the Taliban bounties to kill U.S. soldiers. All lies, just recent lies, spread by the U.S. government and regurgitated obediently in Western corporate media. As I pointed out, I mean, this is an article I wrote at the Gray Zone showing an example of this kind of fake news that is regularly reported on North Korea. And we see the same thing now more and more in China. Anything can be made up. And as I pointed out, the U.S. government has an actual brain control weaponry that is used for many decades, and it's used by the CIA. And what is that? What is the U.S. brain control weaponry called? It is, of course, called the media. This is the classic report from Carl Bernstein, a legendary reporter who helped blast open the story of Watergate, and himself, who was kind of close to the CIA, that helped give him scoops. And this is his legendary article from 1977, a cover story in the Rolling Stone, which is called "The CIA and the Media: How America's Most Powerful News Media Worked Hand in Glove with the Central Intelligence Agency and why the Church Committee covered it up. And I don't need to go through the article. It just goes through. There were more than 400 US journalists who in the past 25 years, so that is from 1952 until 1977, have secretly carried out assignments for the CIA. And he talks about some of the people involved, and he talks about the media outlets. He said, by far the most valuable of these associations was the New York Times, CBS, and Time, some of the closest allies of the CIA. This is the US brain control weaponry that not only targets people around the world, but its own domestic population. And he also talks about other media outlets that cooperated with the CIA, including ABC, NBC, the Associated Press, United Press International, Reuters, the Hearst newspapers, Newsweek, Miami Herald, and New York Herald Tribune, and other outlets. So, I mean, this propaganda against China, like always, is projection for U.S. mass surveillance, for U.S. big tech corporations, for what the U.S. does not only to people around the world, but to its own domestic population. But all Washington has to do is accuse China of something, and the Western corporate media will obediently regurgitate it without any need for evidence. And more as the U.S. escalates its new Cold War on China, we see ridiculous propaganda in the Western corporate media that is just quoting the U.S. government, acting as though whatever the U.S. government says is a fact. Here is an article in The Guardian of Blairism. U.S. sanctions Chinese drug makers amid addiction epidemic. Biden administration targets 4 chemical companies and man said to be world's leading producer of anabolic steroids. Now, this is incredible. It's an incredible example of the U.S. government scapegoating China for a massive, horrific epidemic of pill addiction that was caused by U.S. corporations. You all have probably heard the name of the Sackler family that own Purdue Pharma. The Sacklers are personally responsible with other big pharma corporations for causing a horrible epidemic in the U.S. of people addicted to OxyContin and other pain medication. But more and more, instead of taking action against the billionaire oligarchs from Big Pharma who fund both of the factions of the U.S. dictatorship, the Republican and the Democratic parties, instead we see that the U.S. government and its media mouthpieces are blaming China. They're blaming China. The U.S. has imposed sanctions on Chinese painkiller makers as it vowed to step up action to curb the addiction epidemic that killed a record 100,000 Americans in 2020. 100,000 Americans died from this pill addiction epidemic. But again, no mention of the big U.S. corporations who have profited from this, who have, in these small towns in the Rust Belt in the U.S., in Appalachia, because of them, there are more pills than there are people in some of these communities, in West Virginia and Kentucky. But no, the problem is China. Joe Biden signed an executive order that makes it easier for the U.S. to target foreign drug traffickers. No mention of big pharma drug traffickers. The Treasury Department imposed sanctions on 4 Chinese chemical companies, and one individual, Chuen Fat Yip, who described as one of the largest, if not the largest, producer of anabolic steroids in the world. The State Department also put up a reward offer of up to $5 million for the arrest of this Chinese businessman. I mean, this is incredible. But no mention of the U.S. billionaire oligarchs who have profited from killing their own people, from getting their own people addicted. I mean, there has actually been dozens of lawsuits against the Sackler oligarchs, these billionaires. We have internal emails, internal documents of them admitting that they knew what they were doing, They knew that they were getting people addicted. They are directly responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Americans. But no, the U.S. has scapegoat China for everything.